They say the moss people once lived in every forest, peeking from behind trees, hiding in plain sight. They were once central to our woodland stories, but now they've all but vanished. So who were these strange, quiet folk? Why did their footsteps fade from our forests and from our folklore? And might we really have lost them forever? It is said that long ago, deep in the forests of Germany, there once dwelt a people made of the very land itself. These were not loud creatures. They didn't shriek through the trees or rage through village streets. They didn't harass people or seek to do harm. They might have been working close by to you, but you wouldn't have heard them. You could walk right by them, and you wouldn't have seen them. You might only have felt the quiet, tingling pressure of watching eyes, or sensed the deepening hush in places where the moss grows a little too thick. These were the moss people. But who were they, and what did they look like? Also known as Woodmaidens, Forest Crones, Grove Maidens, and Shaking Crones, there were once many names for the moss folk. They were said to be child-sized, around 3 feet tall, though they were as old as the trees themselves. They had hairy bodies and old, wrinkled faces, their skin gnarled and furrowed like the crumbling bark of ancient trees. Moss grew upon their bodies in patches, clinging to their limbs and faces as it does to old stone in deep forest shade. Some said that they were like little old crones, bent and hunched, twisted like the roots of the trees they slept beneath. Moss people got their name from their clothes, which were formed from the forest itself. They were often described as being wrapped completely in moss, not just wearing it, but enveloped by it, as if cloaked in a living pelt of the forest floor. This meant that their shape was sometimes hard to make out. You might only see a bundle of mossy twigs upon the floor and wonder, did that just move? Some claim that the moss folk were not fey at all, but a secretive and ancient folk, every bit as human as you or I, who'd chosen to live hidden in the forest, dressing in moss to better avoid being seen. But the stories in German folklore are clear. These were not mortals, but the spirits of the forest, and their lives were said to be tied to that of the forest trees. Moss people were said to live deep in the woods, in hollows and in hidden places, places that regular folk wouldn't think to look. Under fallen trunks where the moss is thick, in the crook of a tree you could pass 1,000 times without knowing. They might live in moss huts of their own construction, or even dwell inside hollow trees themselves, getting in and out through little doors that only appear when the forest is sure you're not watching. These were not a solitary people. They worked quietly in 2s or 3s, gathering branches, carrying stones, and spinning thread from delicate hanging thread moss. Most stories involving moss people tend to focus on moss women, with tales involving moss men far rarer. Indeed, the Moss Folk Society appears to have been matriarchal, with the infamous shrub grandmother running the show. Even back in the old times, when the moss people were said to be abundant, to see one clearly was extraordinarily rare. They slipped between trees, could vanish into knotholes, blend seamlessly in with the moss. Perhaps they were the moss itself, or what moss becomes when it dreams too long in the dark. And yet there are a few stories still to be found about moss people and their dealings with mortals, though you'll have to do some reading in German to find anything substantial. As is true of many creatures in fairy tradition, moss people have a bit of a dual nature. They are generally peaceable and helpful, especially when shown respect by humans. They are known to borrow tools or food from people and return the favour with gifts. Magical, never-ending yarn, and leaves that they've turned into gold, or even long-term domestic help. Some stories describe them acting as house spirits, secretly working in the night if properly rewarded. More on this later. And yet, they are quick to take offence. To be clear, these are not fairies of mischief or malice. They don't play tricks or steal for sport. They are spirits of the forest's slow labour, beings made of work and time and rot. However, if one of the moss folk asks for help and is spurned, or if poor quality offerings are made, then the moss people may curse you or blight your lands. For example, a recurring motif in moss people stories is their hatred of caraway bread, which, when offered, provokes the cry, "Caraway bread, our death." So if that's all you've got in your knapsack, you may be in a bit of trouble. Like many fairies, their morality is not human. Thankfully, the moss people's ethics do seem to make more sense than the strange, insensible rules of most fae, instead being rooted in natural law. Beyond ignoring their pleas for help and trying to feed them caraway bread, it's only by harming or disrespecting the forest that one invites their supernatural retaliation. Typical stories of moss people follow certain patterns and themes: reciprocity, protection, and vengeance. Moss people are reminders of an ancient moral code, of what it feels like to be small in the woods, and of what it means to belong to the land instead of ruling it. And while some of these tales survive only in footnotes and fragments, others still live on in the rhythm of our oldest stories, quiet parables passed down through generations. So now, let me tell you one. A story about a promise kept, a gift borrowed, and the price of forgetting a debt owed to the woods.
Once upon a time, many years ago, there came a flood spring, when the streams swallowed the footpaths and the hills turned slick as green glass. Little Annalise, who was no more than 5 at the time, bless her heart, vanished into the trees chasing a dragonfly. When the sun set and no moon rose, Annalise's poor mother cried and wailed, and the whole village called and searched through the night for the little girl, but the forest swallowed every echo, and Annalise was not found. On the 3rd night, Annalise's mother Elsbeth, sick with grief, knelt before a rowan tree at the edge of the wood. There she left a bowl of milk and a loaf of bread, and she whispered, "Please bring her back to me. I leave this here for you, and I promise that if you ever need help, I will repay you." The next morning, Annalise was found, curled beneath the rowan. She was sound asleep, wrapped up warm in a blanket of moss, her hair braided with twigs and tiny flowers. Beside her lay a blackened iron cauldron, pitted with age, but strong. Inside the cauldron was the bowl in which Elsbeth had left the milk the night before. She took the cauldron home, cleaned it, polished it, and fed her child with it that very night. Years passed. The child grew. She spoke little of that day, except to say that the forest had sung to her in a strange language, and a kind old woman with skin like bark and hair like twisted moss had fed her honeyed roots and hummed her to sleep. Always the cauldron served them faithfully. No pot ever boiled more cleanly or brewed such rich broth. And every day Annalise and her mother Elsbeth took a bowl of milk and some bread down to the rowan tree to say thank you to the wood sprites who had kept her daughter safe. Then one day, in the middle of a particularly hard winter, a neighbour named Gertrude came by and asked to borrow the cauldron for a few days. Only days became weeks, and then weeks became months, and when Elsbeth asked for the cauldron's return, Gertrude smiled thinly and said it was just an old pot and that she had better use for it anyway. But that's when old Gertrude's misfortunes began. One night, an old woman, covered in moss from head to toe, appeared at Gertrude's door. "Please, my good lady," said the moss woman, "my children and I are powerfully hungry. Might I ask if you have a cauldron I might borrow, to cook them up some broth? I promise I will return it to you." "I don't have a cauldron," said Gertrude sharply, "not one to lend to the likes of you," and shut the door in the old woman's face. Gertrude's milk turned sour overnight. A couple of days later, the old woman returned, asking the same question. "I wonder," she said softly, "if I might borrow your cauldron, just for a little while. I promise I'll return it." "I told you I do not have a cauldron to lend to you," snapped Gertrude. "But you do have a cauldron?" asked the old woman softly. The door was slammed shut once again. This time, Gertrude's bread somehow rotted before it had even cooled. A couple of days later, the meat spoiled on the spit. Strange moss grew and grew inside her larder door, no matter how often she scrubbed it. And every few days, an old woman cloaked in moss would appear at Gertrude's door. Each time, Gertrude refused. "It's in use," she'd say. "I need it more than you." Or, "It was gifted to me." Or, "It's not safe to lend things anymore. You can't trust anybody." And each time the moss woman only nodded and vanished into the mist. And so Gertrude's misfortunes deepened. One morning she found all her goats dead, their eyes open, their mouths ringed with green foam. A couple of days after that, the roof of her house caved in. Finally, a day came when her son came in from the woods, scratched to ribbons, whispering nonsense and shaking like a reed. He wouldn't speak for a week, save to say that something in the trees had grabbed him, and muttering over and over that the trees are angry with us. Then the moss woman came knocking at the door again. Gertrude by now was so afraid that she dared only open the door a sliver. "I know it's not yours to give," the moss woman said gently, "but you must return it before your misfortunes become grave indeed. It's a pity about your roof. We have so much rain on the way too." "Excuse me," said Gertrude, eyes widening. "How much of your milk will sour?" the old woman went on absently. "How much of your bread will rot? How much meat will spoil before you understand? Those poor goats, that poor son of yours." That evening, as soon as she was certain that the old woman had gone, Gertrude carried the cauldron, pale and trembling, back to Elsbeth and thrust it into her arms. "Take it," she said. "I want no more of this cursed thing." Elsbeth, though surprised, accepted it with quiet relief. That night she placed it back by the hearth, warmed broth in it, and said a quiet thank you to the woods. The next day, Elsbeth cleaned and polished the cauldron again, as she had done before, for Gertrude had not taken good care of it. That very evening, deep in the gloaming, the moss woman came to her door. "I wonder," she said with a smile, "if I might borrow your cauldron. I promise I'll return it." The trouble that had come from lending the cauldron to Gertrude made Elsbeth hesitate. After all, she'd only just gained the cauldron back, and had only cooked a single meal in it. But she also remembered the moss woman had once brought her child home, and that she'd promised to help her if she was ever in need. And so Elsbeth agreed. The moss woman took the cauldron and vanished into the mist. "4 years passed. Both Elsbeth and her daughter Annalise had clean forgotten about the cauldron and the moss maiden, when one day the strangest thing occurred. One autumn morning, the world a breezy flutter of reds and yellows, they came downstairs to find the old cauldron sitting in the centre of the kitchen, polished and warm to the touch, and filled to the brim with glittering gold. Neither Elsbeth nor Annalise ever saw the moss woman again, but they continued to leave bread and milk by the rowan tree, which bloomed every year forever after, even in frost.
Tales like this are not just stories, they are echoes of something deeper. A way of seeing the world, of living beside it rather than above it. And in the forest communities of Germany, that relationship with the land was woven into everyday life. The Moss people were once something of a staple of German folklore, mentioned in the works of the Grimms, as well as in other collectors like Schönwerth and Bechstein. And yet most people today have never heard of them. Perhaps that's because Moss people never had churches. There were no shrines, no written prayers, no gilded saints carved in stone. They weren't worshipped, they were simply known. Known in the way that you know the weather, or the turn of the seasons, or the sound of owls in the night. Folk knew them because, to their minds, they lived beside them. Like many folkloric beings, the Moss People echo a way of life long gone. In those days, people lived closer to the woods, often within them. In old forest communities, the Moss People were seen as the spirits of the trees, with their existence bound to the forest, to its health, its rhythms, its wounds. To harm a tree's bark was to harm the Moss People directly. To peel the skin from a sapling was to kill one of their own. Wilhelm Mannhardt, in his book Wald und Feldkultur, says that whenever a human twists a sapling around its trunk until the bark and cambium peel away, a forest being must die. It is thus a survival instinct that drives them to impress upon the humans they encounter a fundamental law: don't injure any tree. This hints at the idea that Moss People were not just fae that lived in the forest, but were actually seen as the elemental spirits of the trees themselves. It also reveals how people once saw the forest: vast, unmapped, mysterious, and deeply, deeply feared. A forest could shelter you, or it could swallow you up whole if you were unprepared. Folk back then understood that to enter the woods was to step out of the world of men. The Moss People were the forest come alive, given a face. But they weren't only spirits of the forest. Moss People were also tied to the harvest, and, by extension, to the home. People would regularly leave them offerings at harvest time, small bundles of flax tied in knots and left in the fields, little heaps of hay or grain left on the meadow. During flax pulling, workers in the upper Palatinate would leave a few stalks standing, bound at the top so the moss woman might shelter beneath. Even on fruit trees, a few apples were always left hanging, for her. These weren't empty rituals, they were signs of kinship, of shared ground. Many customs across Germany echoed the same sentiments. In the meadows of Old Franconia, when the second cut of hay was gathered in, people always left a small heap behind, saying it belonged to the moss folk, a quiet thank you for the blessings they had brought to the fields. In the Bohemian forest, the last sheaf of ripe grain would remain standing in the field, untouched by sickle or scythe. These were not idle gestures. They came from a belief as old as the land itself, that the spirits of the forest did not end at the tree line. They also lived in the grain field, in the flax patch, in the meadow grass. The same presence that whispered through the leaves and moss also sheltered in the standing stalk or a sprig of hay. Indeed, some people said the Moss People owned the flax, the grain, the hay, and that if you took it all, they would go hungry. But if you left them a token, a handful, a sheaf, a fruit, then your fields would grow fat the following year. It was never much, just a small part returned, a little sign that you remembered the agreement, a little sign that you still believed. These customs weren't quaint, they were covenants. Through these covenants, the Moss People also served as moral enforcers of the land's old laws, rewarding care, punishing carelessness. They didn't demand worship, only respect. Don't strip the bark from a living tree. Don't take more than you need. And don't forget the ones who helped your ancestors survive. But what happens when we do forget? What happens when we stop walking the fields, stop noticing the moss beneath our feet, The forest once echoed with their presence, but in time the trees thinned, the paths grew fainter, and the voices of the moss people were heard less and less. We don't hear much about the moss people these days, and yet once upon a time they were a staple of German folklore. They reflected old values: kindness, hospitality, a reverence for boundaries and for the natural world. But over time, those values were repackaged. The imagery changed. Tree spirits with mossy fingers and flaxen gifts had no place in a world increasingly shaped by Christian iconography. And so, the tales were rewritten. The forest was no longer a place of sacred dwelling, it became a place of temptation, or of danger, or simply of resources to be used. And when the stories changed, and people began to leave the woods behind them, the moss people began to fade. Not all at once, not with fire or with conquest, but quietly, like mist burned away by the rising sun. But it wasn't only religion that was to blame. As people moved from rural to urban life, from hand tools to machines, the language of the forest grew quiet. It no longer fed us. It no longer frightened us. It no longer felt alive in the same way. As the forest moved further away, so did its importance. People just weren't talking about these things anymore. As with many mythical creatures, if not for the work of folklorists like the Grimms, Mannhardt, Bechstein and Schönwerth, we might never have heard of the moss people. How many mythical creatures that once inspired awe or fear have been completely lost in this way. The work that these individuals do is invaluable, and yet, in a cruel twist of irony, as folklore shifted from something lived and experienced into something simply read about, these stories began to lose some of their urgency. In Germany, folk stories like these that once held important moral messaging were now remarketed as Kindermärchen, fairy tales for children. For the moss people, the printed word held an altogether more devastating threat beyond the Christian trivialization of their moral messaging, greater even than the trees felled to make the books that preserved them. Folklorists like Franz Xaver von Schönwerth did vital work preserving these stories before they were lost entirely. But in recording these tales, they may have unintentionally hastened their end. In moss lore, you see, names are everything. They say if you name one of the moss folk, they must leave their human company forever. Perhaps they even disappear entirely. The power of true names is not unique to moss people, being prevalent in many branches of folklore. But if I was a moss person and I heard that people were now writing our names down to be passed on to multiple generations, well then I would certainly keep out of people's way too. So maybe that is why they're so rarely seen. Perhaps. Perhaps not. The moss people had enemies far older than pen and paper. When storm winds howled through the canopy, they were said to carry the Wild Hunt, a spectral procession of hunters, hounds, and the dead. The Wild Hunter was excellent at his trade, and the moss folk were among his prey. In Tale 47 of Grimm's Deutsche Sagen, the moss people's predation by the Wild Hunt is examined in detail. It tells how their only escape from the Wild Hunt was to flee to a felled tree stump, one marked with 3 sharp crosses. If a moss woman fled to such a tree stump and sat upon it when the wild hunt was hunting, she would be safe, but nowhere else offered any such protection. The mean-spirited farmer in the Grimm's tale refuses to help and scoffs at their plight, and so the moss woman attacked the farmer and squeezed him so forcefully that although he'd been strong by nature, he became sickly and miserable. The practice of carving 3 crosses into the stumps of felled trees was regularly carried out by farmers and forest workers. In some places it was believed that the carving had to be completed before the tip of the trunk struck the earth, or while the sound of the crash still echoed around the woods. It was therefore a 2-person job, for nobody could achieve the feat quickly enough alone. All this begs the question, what chance did the moss people ever have? Doomed to be forgotten if not spoken of, and doomed to disappear if they are. Hunted in their own forests by a spectral hunter who never tires, and saved only by an almost impossible ritual involving the very practice that kills them, felling trees. And the trees are falling. All over the world, old groves are being cleared, hedgerows cut back, the wilderness tamed and torn down by degrees. So what happens to a spirit of the forest when the forest disappears? Perhaps they are truly gone then, forever. It would be easy to say so. It might be easier still to say that they were never here in the first place, reflections only of the reverence we once held for the wild and of the stories we once told when we believed the land was alive. But to find out for yourself, you will have to go and take a walk in the woods. Find a spot where the trees are old and strong, a place less trodden, where the moss grows thick and green and undisturbed. Maybe then you'll be able to sense them in the hush between the trees. Maybe you'll catch a glimpse of movement in the glade or down in the hollow, only for it to stop when looked at. Because maybe it's us that have changed. Maybe we just don't know how to listen anymore. Perhaps it's in the quietest of woods that the moss people can be heard most clearly. It's only as the world grows louder, as the trees are felled and the moss grows thinner, that the voices of the forest are drowned out. Perhaps we no longer look at the world with the same kinds of eyes. We stopped walking the old paths. We stopped noticing the hollow trees and the stories tucked beneath the roots. And the moss people, who never forced their presence upon us in the first place, simply vanished from our sight. Yet moss returns. It gathers. Slowly, quietly, it reclaims forgotten stone. It softens ruined walls and silently weaves itself into places we once thought dead. So perhaps the moss people are not gone after all. Perhaps someday their domain will be renewed. And if they do return, it will not be with trumpets or fairy lights. There will be no celebrations or feasts held. It will be in the stillness of the rewilded grove, in the quiet crunch of fallen leaves as someone walks alone down a forgotten forest path. It will be in the child who leaves a piece of bread upon a tree stump, not as an offering, but because they simply felt they should. Whatever the reasons for their disappearance, it's important to remember that when the moss people vanished, they didn't take their vengeance, they took silence. The silence of old paths no longer walked, of strange herbs no longer gathered, of ancient trees no longer greeted. And we, in turn, lost something harder to name. The sense that the forest was watching, that the land was listening, and that somewhere beneath the roots an old woman might be spinning a mossy thread, making clothes for younger mosslings. The moss people are not just creatures of the forest, they are what we left behind when we stopped needing the forest to speak. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the mythic past of Germany. If you enjoyed the video and want to see more, then please give us a thumbs up and tell me what you liked about it in the comments, or which mythical creatures you want to see next. Engagement like this not only really helps the channel, but means you're more likely to see old world content in the future. Also, if you've made it this far, you might be interested to know that this channel now has a Patreon. If you choose to support the channel on Patreon, you'll be able to enjoy old world content completely ad-free, plus you'll get access to our Discord server and some exclusive content too. Finally, a big thank you to my growing number of channel supporters. It's really great to have so many people supporting me directly. It really does mean a lot, so thank you all very, very much. Until next time, I hope all is well in your neck of the woods. I'm Nick, and this is Beasts of the Old World. Thanks for watching.